Welcome to the President and CEO Focus on the Middle Market podcast series, where President and CEO Founder Paul Stukel discusses middle market issues with business leaders from across the nation. Today, Paul speaks with Terry Lutz, recently retired CEO of Signicast, a middle market precision metal castings company based in Wisconsin, about innovation, management, global competition, and his recently published book, In Pursuit of Manufacturing Excellence.
Thank you, first of all, for taking some time to talk to us. I read your book, and it's a very entertaining read, I must say. Pretty fascinating life, pretty interesting life, and I think, at least from my take on it, a fair amount of lessons to be learned for sort of fellow entrepreneurs, fellow CEO executives for middle market companies. And I kind of like to follow the trajectory of the book in this conversation because I think it sort of wraps up an awful lot of things sort of neatly. Things are reinforced constantly throughout the book that sort of start at the very beginning, which, you know, in terms of your formative years, clearly you had a fairly rebellious nature, I think is probably a fair statement.
Yeah, I did. It sort of developed and grew. But by the time I was in sixth grade, I was pretty rebellious. I knew what I wanted, and I knew what I didn't want, and I sort of was going to force my way. Yeah,
I'm a fellow sailor, and I was very happy to see that you enjoyed sailing, and competitively. I'm not very good at it, I don't think, but it's certainly enjoyable. I thought one of the things that was most intriguing to me from an entrepreneurial perspective was your experience of leaving the pack, as it were, and I guess the phrase was sailing to the shore that no one else went to. You know, where you won a race by basically doing what other people didn't do, not following the herd. I mean, does that sort of have some resonance in terms of the rest of your life?
Yeah, I've always been sort of a maverick. And, you know, the whole pack starts and they go to one shore because, you know, in river sailing, the wind's going to be better on one shore than the other shore most of the time. So they all went to one side. So I said, what the heck? Why should I just follow the lead and I'll try the other shore. I went to the other shore, and the wind was so good there that they had to check when I went around the first buoy, how'd I get there? I was so far ahead. When I finished the finish line, they couldn't believe that any boat could be that far ahead of the pack, and I was.
Now was that done based on intuition, or had you sort of studied the breezes ahead of time, or was it just sort of a gut feeling? Just
a gut feeling. I'd say that most of my decisions through my life have been gut decisions, and most of the time my gut's been right. Right.
I just thought that was fascinating. I used to sail the Mackinac, and I'm sure you're familiar with that.
Yep.
And you know, so many people just take the rum line, right? They just go straight up, and that's the way it's going to be, as opposed to people that sort of venture out and try to get the localized winds on either side of the lake, depending on what the conditions are. So that really struck me as being a very, very reflective of your personality.
Yes, it was
based on the entire book. You had a very close relationship with your grandfather, I understand. Which
no, I didn't.
That also struck me as being formative.
No, I didn't. My grandfather died when I was very young, probably about 4 years old.
Oh, I guess I missed that then.
But his legacy is something that I really followed closely. He had taught my father many lessons, and you know, the thing, what is a customer? That was, he put it together. I don't know whether he didn't invent it, I don't think, but he put it together, and it was on every bit of Edgecombe steel stationery. He was a visionary. You know, he built a plant down in South Carolina, a steel warehouse, when there was nothing there. because he knew that people were going to go there and they were going to need steel. The stainless steel truck all denoted the image and the service and putting the customer first. As I said, I think in the book, even the truck drivers, they wore bow ties. They were considered salesmen.
Yeah.
So I learned a lot of those business principles, and most of them came from my grandfather. He and this guy by the name of Edgecombe, they're the ones that started Edgecombe Steel.
I mean, you had some interesting experiences in terms of your early life. The phrase "people telling you that you couldn't do something" resonates throughout the book. There's no question about that. That seems to be a motivational factor for you. Was there any particular one time or one particular episode that you that stands out to you in your early life that sort of convinced you, you know what, these people are wrong, I can do it? I mean, is there some sort of nugget that you can think of, either in the book or outside of the book?
Well, it was really, I have it in the book, and it was my geography teacher, and I was a sophomore in high school. I had already made up my mind I wanted to be a metallurgical engineer, and I had told everybody. People knew that. And he told my mother that I was never going to be an engineer. My math skills weren't good enough. And when I was told that, I said, "What do you mean? I'm going to be a metallurgical engineer. Don't you hear me?" And only my mother sort of gave me a little comfort in that by saying, "Hey, you can be anything you want to be." And I learned from that you can be anything that you want to be. Do you really want it or don't you? If you really want it, go for it.
Yeah.
And if you go for it, most of the time you'll end up succeeding. If you fail, then try again.
Well, and that kind of ties into your management philosophy. I mean, I thought that was quite compelling in that it's fairly different than a lot of corporate leaders in sort of your emphasis on your emphasis on people management was, I think, very, very interesting. Could you maybe briefly touch on because there's a pretty healthy chunk of the book that's devoted to that, sort of focus on your philosophy with respect to managing people?
Well, people are what make things. You could have all the machines and all the automation in the world, but what really drives it is people. And so to have people want to do a good job and achieve, you've got to give them the incentives to do that. And a lot of people think the incentives is just money, but it's not. The incentive has to be the feeling of accomplishment, of being able to go home and say, "Hey, I did this and I'm proud of it." So pride, accomplishment, those types of things are the things that I was really trying to push. The monetary rewards come automatically with being successful. You don't have to dangle them out like a carrot in front of somebody to get them to move. So a lot of it was trying to motivate people to be their best. I have all the respect in the world for anybody that works to their limits, to what they're capable of doing, even if their capabilities are very slim and very little. In other words, if you're a street cleaner and you are a really good street cleaner and you really go at it, I have respect for you.
One of the clear themes of the book and your experience is about, I guess, what I would call adaptation and innovation, in the sense that in adaptation, to use a very simple example, when the company went away from the golf world as sort of their primary customer base, and really taking the leap and moving to a completely different customer base. I mean, that, I guess, the former chairman of Intel called that an inflection point. You know, where basically we all hold hands and we say, okay, this is where our money is made right now, and we're going to abandon that because we know it's not going to last, and we're going to jump into an entirely different area. I mean, that takes some guts, it seems to me.
Well, if you're going to be a successful CEO, you got to be a visionary, and you got to be able to look into the future. Your predictions of the future won't always be right, but you got to consider what are the consequences of this and that. And then when you start seeing things work a certain way, then you got to be able to say, hey, it's time to fold them. I've been holding them too long, and try something different. So that's part of the adaptation. The rest of it is basically the innovation that my basic belief is I'm never happy with anything. If you ask any of my employees, I'm never happy enough with something. It's not quite good enough because it's not perfect. I'm a perfectionist, but I'm a realist along with that. But if you don't strive for the best, then you're gonna be happy with second best, and that was never good enough for me. I wanted to be the best.
On that note, the largest point you make, at least in terms of operational innovation, is the changing from a job-oriented process to continuous flow manufacturing. I mean, obviously, there's a lot of stuff in there in the book about that, and given my rather weak mind when it comes to these things, I probably couldn't explain half of it. But if you could maybe give a sense of that for people that then will go read the book and get the whole picture, could you just sort of explain that briefly for people that are listening?
Well, Job Shop, both of them a Job Shop is a mentality. And basically what it is I have a whole bunch of pieces of equipment, and I have a whole bunch of people, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to finally process an order. So I'm going to have it go to this machine, have this person run it, then it's going to go to another machine, and another person's going to run it, that type of thing. And product moves back and forth between these machines. Sometimes it goes back to the same machine more than once. In continuous flow, there is no backtracking. It is a straight line flow. It starts and then it ends at shipping. And there's no rework loops. There's no deviation from that. It goes down a straight line. If a piece of equipment is used at two different operations, then you buy two different pieces of equipment, one for each of the operations in that continuous flow line. So the way to look at it is more like a chemical plant where there's pipes conduct the material from one reactor to another. In continuous flow, it's just conveyors conveying the material from one operation to another. And it does it all so that people don't have to look to see what they're going to work on next. There's no scheduling required. You just start it on time, and it's going to finish on time. So there's some of the concepts of continuous flow. The biggest thing in continuous flow is two terms I use, and that's backlog and pace. To be able to be predictable in the time it's going to take you to run a given order or parts means you have to control your backlog. And your backlog, the way you control it is by varying your pace at each of the operations. As a backlog builds in an operation, you increase its pace. So you increase its pace by either putting on additional equipment online, or most of the time it's by moving your human resources from one operation to another. That's why you see in the book I stress this cross-training. Our people were cross-trained to be able to do all these different operations because they were moving around all the time. Right. And guess what? Most people love that. Stand there for 12 hours and do the same job over and over and over and over and over again. That gets boring.
Now, why do you think, I guess because as always, innovations always seem obvious once you do them. Why do you think people have not, or at least didn't, embrace that earlier? What are there must be some barriers to that, or is it investment? Is it patience to get the process right? Why didn't everybody do that?
Well, investment is one part of it. So when we started our Module 1, we bet the whole company on that. If it had gone down the tubes, the company would have gone down the tubes. So you got to have faith that you're going to make it work. And these things just don't work by themselves. You have to make them work. In other words, you can put on a piece of automated equipment and turn it on, and boom, it doesn't do what you expected. Well, probably won't. You have to make it do what you expected. There's got to be perseverance there and drive and dedication with knowing I have a clear goal ahead of me and I'm going to reach that goal. And, one of the sayings I have is with failure was never an option.
It's so intriguing to listen to or to witness a U.S. manufacturer, particularly one doesn't have all the advantages of being a Fortune 1000 company, right? It's really refreshing and I think illustrative for us to look at U.S. manufacturers that have succeeded in this sort of maelstrom of globalization. To me, the big question that I would ask you, having been a successful manufacturer and really transformed the company that you took over, how do other people draw lessons from your success in terms of basically beating other companies worldwide, other companies that will have much lower costs of labor, for instance? What are those lessons? I mean, how should other U.S. manufacturers sort of apply the lessons you've provided?
Well, when it comes to labor costs aren't the only cost. Labor, you can reduce the cost of labor through automation. You still need labor, though, but it's a different kind of labor. It's a smarter labor. And so that is basically the way I believe we can compete. With automation, we can minimize the labor differential between us and somebody else. An example was when, in our industry, all of a sudden everybody had to go down to Mexico. Well, before Mexico was down south. You went down south because you could get cheaper labor. And I said, no, we can compete. We don't need cheap labor. We need people who are smart and have a good work ethic. And we have that in Wisconsin. And so we can compete with those. And so that's really what we did, is we took out the non-essential, the non-value added activities that just waste people resources. We took away the drudgery type of work, the things that a machine can do and can do just fine, and we did it through automation. We didn't know anything about automation when we started. We just learned as we went. We had, a vision, and we were just following that vision. So a whole bunch of companies can do that. It's not just labor. It's more than just labor, and labor is really, I use in my book, I guess I should say this, because I really think it'd be interesting. If most manufacturers would stand there and just put a clock on their product, and it would only run when the product was actually being worked on, they would be shocked at how little time it actually is worked on, how much little time is really people are spending working on it. There's so much non-value added activities, and that's what you have to reduce. Moving product around, trying to find stuff. I consider scheduling to be a non-value added activity.
You had some strong words for people's attraction to China as a manufacturing base, obviously thereby hurting U.S. manufacturers. And it struck me that your attitude was that there should have been some action taken because the Chinese are manipulating their currency, and which I think everyone agrees with, and various other elements. You were sort of heaping scorn on companies that automatically, as a matter of policy, said we have to produce this much coming out of China, or maybe some of the other BRICS, but certainly China was the big one. That's. I guess I'm trying to get a sense of how, on a government level, how we deal with that. I mean, as opposed to doing what you did, which was just beat the pants off them through innovation. Because I think you would agree that your company came out stronger because of the challenges that were being faced. I mean, you know, clearly you're a much more adaptive and efficient company because you were forced to be.
No,
what do you think?
I do not agree with that statement. We were going to go the way we went because that's what it took to be the best. Okay, not because of China. China was just a thorn in our side. It was a pretty big thorn, by the way. No. We believe our whole credence is satisfying the customer and getting better every year. We believe in continuous improvement, which basically in our book means you're better in every measure this year than you were the year before. So you just get better and better and better. Success builds on itself. The more successful you are, the more success you want. And that's really what we had. I actually call it an intoxicant. You know, success is very intoxicating.
Right.
So what China was a thorn in our side, and a big one. And what I was talking about with the government was basically the government has two purposes, and one is to maintain our freedom as individuals, and the second is to defend us against foreign interests. Okay, everybody considers that to be, well, fighting wars. Well, no, it's more than wars. It's not allowing one country, a foreign country, to capitalize on the United States as a consumer when they're subsidizing their industry to be able to raise their standard of living. I have nothing wrong with it raising the standard of living of China, India, and it'll go on and on and on. It'll go through Africa, and it'll just keep going. And I have no problem with that, but we can't allow a country to raise its standard of living up to the level of the United States overnight on our backs.
And so what's the answer to that?
One is do not let them manipulate their currency. And the other is to make it so that there are no tariffs, there's no government subsidies. If they're going to subsidize an operation or a product, then there should be retaliation from the United States in the form of tariffs. Let me give you an example. If India could make a part for a Harley-Davidson motorcycle, they don't, we do, Signicast does, but let's say India made it. They could ship it in the United States. There's no tariff, there's no nothing. Harley-Davidson ships that motorcycle back to India and they have to pay a tariff. Now, what's fair in that? So it's fair trade, and fair, so much of it is just plain common sense. And so when you have what's going on, we ran into situations where a part that we were making or lost to China, we lost it for a price that was less than our metal cost. It had nothing to do with labor. It was being subsidized. It was being subsidized by a government.
Right.
Okay, yeah, and our government does some subsidies too, and they should stop subsidizing. Just leave us all alone.
Well, I guess the counter argument to that would be the consumer side of it, and I guess maybe that's where the Walmart thing in the book confused me, I must admit, in that there's always two sides to the tariff concept. I think we'd all agree that it would be best if there were no tariffs, period, and that barriers were completely broken down and it's just compete on the basis of your ability. I think we'd all agree with that. But when the problem with retaliation, as I'm sure you know, is that that ends up hurting the consumer. The consumer, one of the things that Walmart pioneered was getting the absolute cheapest price for everything that they got, and therefore low-income folks had access to things that they'd never had access to before. And if you take away that, then yes, it might help U.S. companies, but does it help the consumer? I guess that's the counter argument. What do you think about that?
Well, my argument is that yes, Walmart went out and found the lowest price, started a whole global trend doing it, and then brought the product back and then did sell it for less. But they sold it for less to the people that lost their jobs. Okay, the people that needed it, the lower price, were the people that were hurt because they lost their jobs to the company that they were buying overseas from.
Right.
So it ends up being a spiral. Are we going to be just a consumer nation, or are we going to be a nation that produces? I've never seen a service country be a world leader. You have to be a manufacturing leader. You have to produce. Wealth has to be produced. Service industry just trades wealth back and forth. To create wealth, you have to have manufacturing, construction, mining, those things that create something. It's a physical, tangible thing.
And I guess that actually brings me back to something you said earlier about having. It's not a question of having enough laborers or low-cost laborers. It's having smart laborers and skilled, to a certain extent, skilled laborers. And there is a lot. I have heard from a lot of folks, certainly in the middle market space and the manufacturing space, that there is a major supply and demand issue when it comes to skilled laborers, machinists, things of that nature here in the U.S. I mean, have you seen that as well?
Well, it depends on what you call skilled labor. There are a couple different kinds. Machinists, Signicast does a tremendous amount of machining. We train them. Okay, what we want is we want people that are willing to work, that have a good work ethic. They come to work every day. They do the best they can. We'll teach them how to do the operations. They don't have to know it walking in the door. There's nobody who walks in the door and knows how to make an investment casting. We teach them. So when it comes to skilled labor, like maintenance mechanics, tool makers, that does take outside training. You can't just train all of that on the job. You can some, but not all of it. And so there is a shortage of those kinds of skilled labor. But people are mixing up the word skilled with people that want to work and have a work ethic. It doesn't mean that they have to be skilled. They have to want to work. There's too many people in this country that don't want to work. They just want a handout.
Well, okay, so moving on to the what was, I'm sure, a very painful experience. No, not painful. That's a bad choice of words. That was a challenging decision, the decision to sell. You obviously touch on this in the book at some length, but just in a nutshell, I mean, what were your thought processes in going into that obviously life-changing decision?
Well, I did not want to. I had no children that wanted to run the company, and I wouldn't have necessarily wanted to pass it on that way either. But I didn't want something to happen to me and my wife to have to figure out what to do with Signicast. I wanted to have some say in what was going to be the future and who was going to be owning Signicast in the future. So that's why I decided that it was time for me to do that, not after I had already croaked. So that started me on the thing. And then it was a matter of finding what I would hope to be the suitable steward for running the company in the future. And so, again, it was broken down into the private equity, the more of the strategic type buyer. Yeah, and those. Right. And we went through that. And so I didn't want to sell to a company that was going to flip Signicast every 5 to 7 years. So I was looking for something that was more stability than that. And the company that we found, with the help of William Blair, was the Pritzker Group. And they seemed to fit the bill of what we were looking for. And so that's who we ended up selling to.
And as I understand it, I mean, again, you talk about this in the book to some extent. The subsequent to the acquisition, there seemed to have been a little bit of a, I guess you'd call it seller's remorse. I mean, that may be too strong, but clearly some friction that developed. And the reason I ask it is not necessarily because, again, full disclosure, I know the Pritzkers, and they were actually on a board member they were board members of a previous company that I owned. But I think it's instructive to people who are going through that now, or will be going through that in the near future, to get your sort of perspective on how things turned out subsequent to the sell. Because, as we all know, the dance up to the sell is exhilarating and challenging, and when the money finally changes hands, it's very exciting. But it's what happens afterwards that's important in many ways. I mean, so what are your thoughts on that?
Well, it wasn't buyer's remorse at all. I stayed on for 3 years and ran the company, working for the Pritzkers. I stayed on to make sure everything just got stable, and then we had the Great Recession, and I sure wasn't going to leave Signicast during that period of time. So we worked through the Great Recession and continued to grow by 2010 and 11. And then, I was getting tired. I couldn't do the job of CEO effectively sitting at a desk anymore. And so I knew it was time for me to go. Did I want to go? Absolutely not. Did they want me to go? No, they did not want me to go. I kept saying, hey, we ought to find a replacement. I need help in picking which one of our guys would be the best, that type of thing. And they sort of blew me off because I think they were hoping I'd live forever. So finally, I had to put my foot down and say, hey, I want to retire. I want to be gone. And that is the only time that the relations with the Pritzkers turned a little dicey. Before that, we had a great working relationship. There were no problems. But they let me run the company the way I always had. Then it was a matter of picking my replacement. And what I wanted, of course, is I wanted somebody from the inside, but I needed help in evaluating them. I knew from my opinion who they should be, but it had to be somebody that could also work with the Pritzkers. And so that's when we started having problems, because it looked like they were headed that they were just going to go to the outside, and I didn't particularly care for that idea. So that's when it got a little tough. And then they ultimately did end up picking the candidates from inside the company.
Given your experience over these many years and your really impressive success in the manufacturing world here in the U.S., where do you see U.S. manufacturing going from here? I mean, are you optimistic? I mean, because there are all kinds of false dawns that seem to be popping up here where, just recently Goldman Sachs just came out and said, what manufacturing revival? It's the numbers just don't hold that to be true. What are your thoughts on that?
It all depends on our government. If our government turns into the nanny state that it is and becoming worse, that's not going to help manufacturing. We don't want our government to stand there and give handouts to business. We want them to leave us alone, but they're over-regulating the living hell out of us. The regulations just continue piling, and we become more and more non-competitive overseas when those kinds of regulations are put on us and aren't put on other people. So that's where they're hurting us. Where they should be defending U.S. manufacturing is, again, by making sure that we're on a level playing field, that everybody is playing the game fair and square. And then I think what you'd find is Yankee ingenuity will win every single time. We are creative people. We're innovative people. We know how to make things happen. All you got to do is give us the freedom to do so.
Be sure to check back for future editions of the President and CEO Focus on the Middle Market podcast series. Thanks for listening.